You're tuning in to Advancing with Amy, mental health warrior and neurospicy mama, your go-to podcast for all things mental health and neurodivergent. In this episode, I sit down with the inspiring Jill Sitnick, an author and advocate who's transforming the way we view trauma and healing. Jill is the founder of The Journey Sage, an educational platform that demystifies MDMA therapy for PTSD to help dispel the stigma of psychedelics for mental health. After a lifetime of unprocessed childhood trauma, Jill found healing through psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. If you've ever wondered about the groundbreaking world of psychedelic therapy, this is a conversation you can't miss. Jill shares her brave journey of overcoming childhood trauma-induced PTSD using MDMA therapy and offers a wealth of insight into this unconventional yet increasingly recognized path to recovery. Join us as we dive deep into the mysteries of the mind, uncover the potential of psychedelics in therapy, and explore the simple yet profound ways we can reclaim our lives. Get ready for a heartfelt and eye-opening discussion that just might change your perception of therapy and healing. MDA therapy. Could this be the future of mental health treatment? Today we're talking with Jill Sitnick. Welcome, Jill. We're happy to have you here today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. It'd be a delightful conversation.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. I'm especially interested in the book that you've written. I saw you wrote a book. Is it called Surviving Jill or
Rescuing Jill?
Rescuing Jill? Sorry about that. So
Okay.
go ahead and tell me how that started.
Rescuing Jill is my memoir of healing childhood trauma-induced PTSD with the psychedelic MDMA. It is a retelling of the healing that took place over a year of my life with 3 therapeutic journeys, with the last journey including transcripts in the memoir. And the goal of the book is to explain how MDMA therapy works, that it's not turnkey. And yet, on the other hand, while talk therapy by itself might be the horse and buggy on the country road, MDMA therapy for PTSD is the zippy sports car on the highway. So people who are, unfortunately, like me, have experience with child abuse or neglect, they get the book. It makes sense because there's a lot of repetition. There's a lot of going back to, some really tough, painful memories from childhood. People who do not have a history of child abuse find the book repetitive. So
Interesting.
that's my little memoir.
Well, it looks great. I read the chapters you had on your website, and I was thinking, and you just said it took you a year of recovery. That's nothing compared to what you went through. I mean, really, that's
Yep.
amazing. So can you explain a little bit for those of us that don't know or haven't heard of MDMA therapy, what exactly that is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So MDMA is the abbreviation for a very long name that I cannot pronounce. It is most commonly known as the street drug ecstasy or Molly. So the kids at the club or hanging out at the party, that's assuming that it's pure MDMA and not cut with anything else, which anymore you really can't guarantee. But MDMA, the basic drug involved with ecstasy. From a trauma perspective, what MDMA does for someone with a trauma background or in a PTSD spiral or with a complete nervous system dysregulation, MDMA calms the body down. And for those of you who are listening, I have my hands on my shoulders because I think my entire life, my shoulders were at my ears. I was very tense my whole life, very anxious my whole life. And so MDMA allows my shoulders to come down. It allows a release of serotonin in the brain, which is the feel-good chemical, increasing connection. It decreases blood to the amygdala, the brain's fire alarm center. And so for a trauma patient, or me specifically, for the first time in my life, my body was calm enough to tell 2 people, my therapist and a guide, so 2 people, 1 patient as per required, as per the clinical trial protocols, which I can talk about, I was able to tell these two people for the first time that I was absolutely sure that if my father was in the room, he would have his hands around my neck trying to kill me. And just imagine trying to have that kind of conversation without any sort of enhancement and dealing with that fear. That's not having fearing for your life is not a great experience. And then so you would kind of think, oh, well, that would be an amazing healing process. What's really fascinating about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and this applies to pretty much any psychedelic that you're working with, most of the healing happens in the days, weeks, and sometimes in my case, even months after the procedure. So if you think about a surgery, the surgeons, they go in and they work on you for a couple of hours that one day, that's the procedure. But then you might have days, weeks, and months of recovery. That's very much the way this particular medical procedure is. So it's super important that you have therapeutic support. And it basically worked memory by memory. I would have a memory of my father beating me when I was 3 years old. And instead of remembering that memory with the feelings of fear that a toddler would have, my body stayed calm, which allowed me to look at that memory. And I'm holding my hand up like it's like a television screen. I could look at that memory and say, wait a minute, the universe wasn't against that child. That child wasn't a bad child. There was nothing wrong with her. That father, that 6'2", 230-pound man, there was something wrong with him.
Right.
And those reframes, almost childhood memory by memory, which is why it took 3 journeys over the course of a year. There were a lot of memories to just get me to the point of healing the PTSD symptoms of hypervigilance and being suicidal. That's how many memories there were to deal with. And so that's like MDMA therapy 101, big picture.
So I find that really interesting. So I assume they do a like microdose or something like that, or no?
No, not with MDMA. MDMA, the clinical dose, and this is online. This is not me prescribing. This is not medical advice
Right.
because the clinical trials are all the information online. Your average, depending on weight, and some people even argue whether weight is even a factor or not, but you're definitely not going over 200 milligrams for a therapeutic dose. If you go on Reddit, you'll hear some crazy stuff about what people are doing. Therapeutic dose, don't go over 200 milligrams. And make sure you take some supplements because the next day you're going to feel like there's a bit of a hangover because you've had so much serotonin released in your brain. The next day you don't have as much, so you feel kind of down. But it's super important. Pay attention to dosing. There is no microdosing protocol for MDMA because it releases so much serotonin.
Wow. Okay. So then you do your initial session with them and you said you're recovering sometimes up to months. How does that play into, do you go to a weekly session or?
Well, so I fell into this therapy. My partner of over 20 years had passed away. I decided to treat myself to grief therapy. You can only talk to your friends so much. And that death shattered me. I needed that support. And then about 18-ish months after his passing, I wound up having the widow's fog was dissipating. And I wound up having a panic attack over a work email, like a level 1 kind of thing. My body reacted completely out of scope compared to what this email situation was. And so I went back to my therapist and, very long story short, got diagnosed with the PTSD, started to share with her some of the childhood trauma. And then she decided to tell me that she was in a program to become a psychedelic assisted psychotherapist. Go take a look at the MAPS research, maps.org, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. I know it's a mouthful. They're the ones who ran the clinical trials. And at the time they were done, their 2 clinical trials, were 3/4 of the people in the trials after 3 sessions no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. Now, in the clinical trials, they only gave about a month between administrations of the psychedelic MDMA. For my therapy, because it was underground, I was not part of a clinical trial. My therapist and guide pretty much allowed my healing to set up the cadence. And I still maintained my weekly or biweekly schedule with my therapist. And as the reframes started to slow down and the fear was still there, that's when we knew I was ready for another one. And to give you the context, I said yes to the therapy in the spring. We prepared for months. My first journey was September. My second journey was December. My third journey was not until May. So I had nice long chunks of time to really integrate and reframe and really work on the neuroplasticity to change how I thought about my childhood.
Right. So now are you actually doing that kind of therapy or am I remembering wrong?
I'm in Third Wave's psychedelic coaching program. I have sat with people. I'm very much aware that I am not a therapist and
Okay.
I don't plan to be. I'm much more comfortable in the coaching space. With that said, I can probably refer people, probably in another couple of months, I'll have a few more people that I can refer folks to. I've decided that while I have sat with people with MDMA journeys, that I want to make sure the same way that I was properly resourced with an amazing therapist, an amazing guide, other people deserve that quality of care
Yeah.
too. Get me in a coaching situation with psilocybin or another mind enhancing situation, absolutely. But for PTSD and severe childhood trauma, I would recommend somebody else.
Okay. So talk to us a little bit about what you actually do then through your coaching.
So I haven't started yet. This is so exciting. I get to
Oh,
start it with you. So I have completed my IPAC coaching, just plain old coaching certification years ago, way too many years ago. I did executive coaching training. And so I'm not new to the coaching space, but because of my partner's passing, I never got the hours required. So I never actually got the full certification way back when. So I've recently gotten that certification, and then I happened to find Third Wave Psychedelic Coaching Program. And actually, we just went on the intensive in Costa Rica where it was beautiful. I've done a lot of ceremonies, I've done a lot of medicine work, but they really outlined well what a facilitated journey is like, especially with community. It was beautiful. And ultimately, at the end of this program, I might open up my shingle and say, look, if you are in a career transition or if you're in a life transition or you have some sort of blockage and you can't figure out what it is and you have some experience with psychedelics and maybe you'd like some help preparing, you have your journey on your own and then you want to have some sort of integration with me, that's probably what I'm going to wind up doing. I might even wind up working with a retreat group, but I'm also working on creating. I get people who reach out to me with really basic questions because this is a niche topic. People don't know
mhm.
about this yet. And so I'm actively working on creating some briefs that condense the information because even though I have a great YouTube channel, people they don't necessarily like when I'm like, well, go check out my YouTube channel. Like they want to know specifically the answers to the questions. So I'm actively working on that too. My goal more than anything else is to be an advocate and an educator. I started my career as an English teacher way back when the dinosaurs roamed. And so if I can help people understand this space as it starts to develop, then I will have achieved a lot of my goals.
That's exciting for many reasons because it is a developing kind of field. But secondly, just to be opening up your own practice, that's exciting. Your
Yeah,
own
at some
coaching
point.
business. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So I'm curious, going back to the MDMA,
Mhm.
do you ever need touch ups? Like you go in and after a couple
Great question.
years, you're like, oh, I think I need a touch up here.
That's a phenomenal question. So I had my 3 MDMA journeys with my doctors. I then went back to them over the next year and a half for 2 additional psilocybin journeys. And people will be like, why did you do that? You no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. And I make this comment, and some people like it, some people don't. But here's the best way I can think of explaining it. The MDMA sessions, they healed the capital T traumas. That year healed, I wasn't good enough. There's no reason for me to live. The universe is always against me. I was marinated in abuse and neglect for 19 years. My mother was clinically depressed her entire life. She attempted suicide multiple times. She shot herself when I was 5 and survived. My father was a domestic abuser. It didn't matter who you were. If you were a woman, he worked really hard to either hit you or tell you how stupid and ugly you were pretty consistently. And when you're marinated in that kind of environment, there's a lot of layers to unpack. And so after those 2 psilocybin journeys, my doctors actually wound up moving away. And about 6 months after, I was kind of like, oof, I'm kind of feeling I could really use a little bit of a touch up. And I started experimenting and going on psychedelic tourism retreats, which is why I've become even more interested in what different psychedelics do for trauma. So I've worked with MDMA, I've worked with psilocybin, magic mushrooms. I've worked with Bufa or 5-MeO DMT, regular DMT, iboga, Cambo. I've worked with a variety of substances to understand how they react to trauma so I can tell people about them. I consider psychedelic work in a lot of ways self-care. The same way you go get a massage however you get a massage, or you go consistently work out. If you're trying to constantly improve yourself, that's how I tend to use these substances. Very specifically, MDMA, though, I had my 3 journeys with my doctors. About a year ago, because we're in October. About a year ago, I had a relationship kerfluffle, and it brought me right back to when my partner had passed away. My system was completely dysregulated. I realized I had a trauma point. I asked a friend of mine to come over and sit with me during an MDMA journey because I knew that I needed to open up my heart and to heal that trauma point. But I don't use MDMA for those kind of checkups every 6 months. For that, I use psilocybin. It's great for it'll show you your patterns. It'll show you why you're doing things.
Okay. I have a question. It's probably a silly question, but I think probably a lot of the listeners have this question.
Yeah.
If you go do this, is there any risk with either of the therapies of getting addicted to any of these things?
Not with MDMA. Let me rephrase. Anybody who has an addictive personality can, of course, get really enthusiastic and really into something. There is no real evidence of getting addicted to MDMA because the come down is so uncomfortable. It takes a while to recover from MDMA. You have to get your serotonin back up. Kids are using it at raves, at nightclubs. It's out there, but you're not seeing treatment programs for MDMA because it's just not that kind of drug. And mushrooms, magic mushrooms or psilocybin, ironically, if you use them too much, your system builds up a tolerance for them and they start losing the impact they have to heal. It's not to say that somebody doesn't get really into psychedelics and might do a little too much for 6 months because they're so excited about how it can expand their minds. But it's not like people are going to treatment facilities for psychedelic addiction. Ketamine, a little bit different. Ketamine does have the potential for addiction.
Yeah, I have heard that. But that sounds like the MDMA and how do you say it?
Psilocybin.
Psilocybin. All right. That's a good word. That sounds much safer than I thought maybe it was. That's wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because they're labeled Scheduled 1 drugs, everybody automatically assumes they've got an addictive quality. The irony is that smoking and alcohol are not Schedule 1 drugs, and we all know how addictive they are.
Right.
It's another conversation for another day.
Or we could talk about caffeine. There's a lot of things out there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So tell us, how is your book doing and how is the response to it?
Oh gosh, I don't even pay. I'm the worst business person. I don't even pay attention to it. My goal is really just to help people understand what's going on.
That's kind of what I meant. It was like, are people responding and coming to you and saying, "Oh my gosh, this happened to me and
Yeah.
it resonated
Yeah.
with me."
I would say on average, every 2 weeks, I had someone reach out to me. They either found me on YouTube or via LinkedIn. And usually it's questions. Um, and I'm pretty active on LinkedIn in terms of the research. I'm active on YouTube in terms of my experience. And so I wind up answering a lot of questions. And I would say half the time I actually recommend to the person, look, psychedelic, you're not ready right now. You might be in a crisis state, get into therapy, get an antidepressant right now, or they might have something coming up that's really dysregulating them. Psychedelic assisted psychotherapy is not something you jump into next week.
Right.
It's something you really prepare for. I said yes to this therapy in the spring, and I didn't even have my first journey until September. Now, I didn't have experience with psychedelics, so I had all of those stereotypes in my head, but that does illustrate this is a medical procedure to prepare for, not to simply jump into because, hey, I heard Jill Sitnick had a really good response to it.
Right.
So I'm super careful when people reach out, get a diagnosis. Psychedelics are not good for people who have a personality disorder or have a history of schizophrenia in their families. Psychedelics can amplify something that's going on with you. So imagine if you do have a personality disorder and all of a sudden a psychedelic would amplify that particular feeling or behavior. So you have to be really careful to not just jump in, do it the right way, get a diagnosis, work with people you trust. I know the challenge right now is that this is all underground and you have to find facilitators, and that's a barrier to entry. But even more so of a reason to not grab a bunch of mushrooms and think everything is going to be okay. This is a medical
Right.
procedure. You have to find qualified folks.
And didn't you say that I think I read something that said it was supposed to be FDA approved in August and then it wasn't?
Yep, it was delayed.
Oh, oh wow,
Yeah,
that's disappointing.
to
Mm.
say the least. The Veterans Association, I think, was maybe more upset than I was. Yeah.
Really? I didn't even think about that, but with the PTSD, that would be a big issue.
They have ongoing trials that have been funded philanthropically, and they've always said they're not going to move forward actually using this healing modality until the FDA approves, which makes sense. I mean, VA is federal government. How are they going to use an illegal substance?
Right.
But I think it really put them in a bind. But I do believe they're continuing on their research too. And that's fundamentally what the FDA said. They didn't say, no, we're not approving. They said, we're delaying. We want to have a little bit more information. There was quite a bit of propaganda that was brought up in the FDA advisory committee meeting to just too much doubt. And really, people are finding it hard to believe that something our whole lives that we've been media fed is bad and harmful can suddenly have a therapeutic use. It's kind of a big jump, which is one of the reasons why I have conversations with lovely folks like you to share my story and to help fight the stigma.
Which I appreciate. So I have one other question. You were talking about how there's some philanthropic people that are giving money to help. If you don't have access to that, is this a very expensive treatment since it's underground?
Oh, that depends on who you're working with and what your diagnosis is. That's a hard question to answer.
Okay.
I would say that would be a really good question to ask a facilitator. What are you charging? What does that include? The same way you would be a consumer for any other service. th- Those questions are exactly what you should be asking. I find underground pricing to be pretty even, and most practitioners do have some sort of sliding scale if you're really jammed up. But yeah, I'm sorry, I can't answer that. I won't speak for
No, that's okay. I just wondered if it was in line with regular therapy or that kind of thing. But I guess it could change. Just like regular therapy, there's depends on who you go to.
right. I think one of the things too that's going to happen, fingers crossed, don't know how many years it's going to take, is that insurance companies are going to realize that this kind of therapy for PTSD, anxiety, depression, even though it'll be a bigger lump sum up front because you've got two people working with a client for 8 hours. That's how long a therapeutic journey can last. And then, of course, you have your ongoing regular therapy. But my PTSD symptoms, being suicidal, hypervigilant, they went away after a year, right? I continued working on therapy because I wanted to. So as opposed to paying for somebody's antidepressants for their entire life versus let's do this healing, let's hope that insurance companies get on board at some point for helping folks with the costs when it gets approved.
I would think they would recognize that because not only are they saving on, let's say, the antidepressants that you mentioned, but also hospital stays are awful. Those are very high cost.
That's it. Yes, another component. Yeah.
Yeah, they could definitely be saving money just like they do. Right now, they're very into doing things preventively
Mhm.
to save money on the end. So you'd think they'd relate it to that, you would hope. So,
We'll see. I don't know how many years it's going to take. It might not even be in my lifetime. I don't know, but
right.
I would assume at some point this is going to be standard.
Okay. This has been fascinating. Is there anything that you want to leave our audience with or mention that we haven't talked about yet?
Yeah. So if people in the audience if they themselves or they know somebody with a diagnosis, PTSD, depression, anxiety, head on over to clinicaltrials.gov and do a search for that particular ailment, and you will see what clinical research is being done. You can do a reverse search, LSD, MDMA, and psilocybin, magic mushrooms. They've all been FDA labeled as breakthrough therapies, meaning the FDA doesn't see anything currently on the market that does as well in the clinical trials than those substances. So you can even search by those substances. So don't take Jill Sitnick's word on it. Go ahead, clinicaltrials.gov, take a look what's out there. You can also do a regular Google search because there are independent companies that are doing a lot of research. And if you're somebody who's like, there's no way I'm ever going to do anything underground, but I'd love to get in a clinical trial, set up a Google alert for the clinical trial that you want, because companies advertise on their own websites and there's no way you can, companies and universities, and there's no way you can keep track of all of them whenever they have their grant money to do it. So set up a Google alert. That's pretty much what I tell folks because they're like, well, how do I find out about stuff? Google alert.
That's great advice. And if somebody does want to work with you on your coaching, how do they do that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I'm thejourneysage.com. Head on over to the website. I got a beautiful little Calendly. Yeah, happy to. I have been finding great success with a macro dose and then some micro dosing to expand the neuroplasticity to be able to change behavior. So happy to share that insight and to work with folks as they're moving forward in their lives. Thank you for the opportunity. This is still new to me.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. This has been wonderful.
Cool.
All right, everybody. This was Advancing with Amy, mental health warrior and neurospicy mama. And that wraps up another insightful episode. Today we had the privilege of diving into the world of psychedelic-assisted therapy with Jill Sitnick. We uncovered how her book, Rescuing Jill, is not just a memoir, but a beacon of hope and information for those navigating the turbulent waters of PTSD and childhood trauma. Jill shared her personal journey of healing, the nuances of MDMA therapy, and her future plans in coaching. It's a fascinating, emerging field that holds promise for many in the mental health community, offering a new perspective on trauma recovery. We are grateful for Jill's transparency and dedication to demystifying these therapies and providing education around them. Don't forget to visit Jill's website at thejourneysage.com for more information and resources. If you enjoyed today's episode, please take a moment to rate, review, and share it with your friends and family. Your support helps us continue delivering meaningful conversations. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Keep advancing, warriors.